Hello, everyone, and welcome today to our webinar. We're really excited to have you here for the fourth in our Digital Impact Assessment series. Today's topic is Enhanced Environmentally Integrated Design Enabled by Digital Advances. The webinar today is hosted by the International Association for Impact Assessment, or IAIA. We are the leading global network on best practices for using impact assessment to make informed and thus better decisions. My name is Bridget John, and I'm joined by my colleague Laura Lee, who is working to make sure this goes forward smoothly and seamlessly in the back end. Now, if you hear or see anything that you'd like to share, feel free to tweet that out or share it on your social networks. You'll see our Twitter handle there at IAIA Network, or you can use our hashtag for our webinars at IAIA Webinar. Now, whether you are brand new to IAIA or a seasoned IAIA member, I encourage you to visit our website. There are always new things popping up and going on for free for both members and non-members alike to access. Now, all of our video webinars, like today, are available on demand and available to all. So you'll see we have a few of them listed on screen there. There's one on artificial intelligence, on emerging technologies, on big city mega growth, and just a wealth of other topics on health and biodiversity and resettlement and conflicts. So feel free to check those out. There is a webinars page. You'll find that listed under resources at our website. We do have our annual conference coming up next year. More on that in a minute. And in addition to our webinars, we have a variety of other training resources for you. We do have some online training courses throughout the year. The next ones will be available in September, but you can check those out on our training page on our website, and those registrations will be opening soon. And we do have a professional development program, which is a little bit longer term, 3 months in length, where you view the material online, but what's unique about it is you're paired one-on-one with a mentor, and that has received a lot of really positive feedback. People really do like having that mentorship component to it. So a couple different options in addition to our webinars for training for you. And of course, on our website under resources, there's a wealth of free downloadable publications. Whether you want something quick like our Fast Tips, which gives a quick 2-page overview and 5 things to do and 5 things to know about that topic, or you want something a little bit more in depth like best practice principles or guidance documents, we have that on our website. So please go to IAIA.org, click on the resources tab and check that out. We hope you'll find something valuable to you there. I mentioned before our upcoming annual conference. It takes place in April, so almost a year away, but we hope you'll consider joining us in Dublin, Ireland. We're really excited to be going there, and even though it's almost a year away, the reason I'm mentioning it is because if you would like to be part of the program and submit a topic for discussion there as part of a session, our session proposal deadline is July 24th. So you'll see our website there, or you can get to it from our regular IAIA.org website, and the submission link for sessions is there. The topic is Impact Assessment for Just Transformation. So excited to hear what everyone has to talk about on that topic. And maybe you don't want to do a whole session and you just want to present on a particular topic, and we will have a second wave of submission process for papers and posters coming up later in the year. So please consider joining us in Dublin for next April's conference. It is going to be great. We hope you will join us. Before we jump into the reason that you are all here, the topic of the webinar, just a few bits of housekeeping for you. We are indeed recording this webinar. In a couple days, you will receive an email with a link to the recording. There will be a Q&A session at the end, but please don't feel you have to wait to post those questions. You will see a questions pane in your GoToWebinar control panel. Feel free to pop those questions in when they come to you anytime throughout the webinar. We are moderating those throughout, so keep them coming. And the slides are available to you in the handouts pane of your control panel there. And also when you receive the recording email in a couple days, there will also be a link to those slides. So if you don't catch them today, you've got another chance. So without any further ado, I'm really excited to jump into this topic. It sounds so intriguing, and I'm excited to learn more about this from Josh and our panelists. So I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to our moderator, Josh Fothergill. He is a longtime IAIA member and the host of this Digital Impact Assessment series. He instigated it, and we're so glad that he did. Josh is the founder and director of Fothergill Training and Consulting, and they provide independent impact assessment expertise and capacity building services. Josh is also the lead author of the State of Digital Impact Assessment Practice, launched in late 2001, and he created the award-winning EIA Quality Mark Scheme. So Josh, over to you. Looking forward to it.
Thank you very much, Bridget. Thank you. And welcome everyone to this webinar. We're continuing the theme, if you've been to any of these other sessions, of digital impact assessments. And I'll do around 10 minutes to just give you an introduction to what that means and how that links back to the State of Digital Impact Assessments reports from a couple of years ago. But today we're going to be very much focusing on the great work that Atkins are doing in pushing this area forward and looking at enhanced environmentally integrated design. So this is the fourth webinar in the series, and you can access all the others, as Bridget already mentioned, through the resources section on the IAIA website. What I wanted to do, though, was before we really get into that enhanced environmental design and what Atkins have been doing around that, just to make sure everyone's kind of comfortable with what we mean by digital impact assessment. It isn't the impact assessment of digital technologies and their environmental and social consequences, although that is something that a number of impact IAIA members are interested in. What we're talking about here is about bringing digital technologies and the transformational approach of digital into the impact assessment process and community and profession, and it can take many forms. So what do we mean by digital impact assessment? Well, it's not formally defined as far as I'm aware. It certainly wasn't a couple of years ago in any national impact assessment laws. None of the Financial Institute standards, such as the IFC performance standards or anything, really get into digital impact assessment or the application of digital technology within impact assessment. From the research that I conducted a couple of years ago and continue to talk to people about, based on that research, there's lots of different views as to what it is and what it's not, and what the scope of digitizing impact assessment really is. And that really differs based on experience, perspective from practice, where you are around the world. And there was this IAIA Innovation Grant funded project that sought to frame the subject, and I'll show you the cover of the report and some content from that in the next few slides. What we came up with through that was, I suppose, trying to bring a definition forward. So the definition that IAIA adopted within that report is the use of advances in digital technologies and their applications in the pursuit of enabling more effective impact assessment practice. So whether you're doing health impact assessment, you're doing EIA within an infrastructure project in your country, you're doing environmental social impact assessment to help kind of multilateral financial institutions choose whether they're going to fund projects. It's the bringing advances in digital technology into that process. And the idea is that it's intending to make them more effective. So it isn't just digital for digital's sake, but it's how we're going to make our practice of impact assessment more effective. So there is the report, as Bridget mentioned, late 2021 launch. So the State of Digital Impact Assessment Practice, going to give a snapshot of kind of where we are at that time and the fact that things are going on all around the globe. So you can access the report through that link at the top. You can access the webinar and various other content also through the links on that page. And as Bridget mentioned, this slide deck will be available afterwards for you to pick up those links. So one thing the report did under that broad definition of digital impact assessment is kind of identify 10 areas, 10 elements of where digital is coming into practice. Some of these more driven by digital approaches and technologies being brought into impact assessment and enabling progress, and others looking at particular aspects of our impact assessment practice, such as screening, stakeholder engagement, the documentation that we produce, and looking at how we digitize those particular aspects and activities. Now, in some of the previous webinars, we've said, and today's webinar, we're going to focus on artificial intelligence, such as the last one we did on Molina and the IFC. But today's approach is actually taking and drawing across quite a number of these different areas and really bringing it together to enable the environment into design. So taking a little bit of a different approach in terms of context. So there's a number of areas where change management is required, and I'm sure some of these will be touched upon in our forthcoming presentation from our Atkins specialists. But we need to see new approaches and consideration of data, and there's trust issues in relation to that, as well as how we integrate that data. Is it digital? Is it available to access to all, or is it only at certain sites? There's issues around quality and cost, that focus on effectiveness. Are we moving practice effectiveness forward? Is there a risk that we're cutting out skilled humans within the decision process? And how much do we need to think about that? There are issues of engagement, risks around digital divide, equity, inclusion, and these kind of things. Digital can massively increase our reach, but at the same time it can exclude. So we need to think about some of those issues, particularly where we're using digital technologies in stakeholder engagement. And we also need to be thinking about issues such as safety, privacy, security of that data and of that information that perhaps hasn't been as on the agenda for impact assessment as it might be as we move to this digital transformation. What I did want to highlight is, whilst our speakers today are based in the UK, this is very much a global transformation, and there is progress being made all over the world, different applications, different ideas and initiatives coming up all over the place, from the use of drones and digital kind of monitoring devices for ecology or air quality in many different parts of the world, to digital platforms for impact assessments, such as the Envigo tool out of Serbia that was or developed by a company in Serbia that was the subject of our first webinar. So you can see there are many different areas making progress, and this was back in 2001. There has been quite a lot of advancement that has been discussed at IAIA conferences since then. And then one thing that the state of digital impact assessment practice highlighted was actually there's an opportunity through this digital transformation, through bringing these advances in technology into impact assessment, for impact assessment for itself to change, for it to advance, for it to look in different ways. And of course, that's one of the things we're going to be, or a major thing that we're going to be looking at today, is how can that integrate into design and really push things forwards. If we look further to the future, the State of Digital Practice report highlights a number of other areas and questions that we might want to think about and contemplate, and these might be useful as we hear for you to think about as we hear about the thoughts for today. So can digital impact assessment or the bringing in of digital technology provide new ways to actually demonstrate our environmental, social, or governance outcomes that we're trying to achieve within our projects? Can we provide better narrative or better clarity around those? Probably not for today particularly, but we've covered this certainly in session 3 of the webinar. It's covered in the report, is what role might artificial intelligence play in the future delivery of the impact assessment process? And certainly some interesting research going on in Denmark, a 4-year study coming to the end at the moment called the DREAMS project. We're going to try and tie into them at some point later this year. They're planning a webinar in late September that we might try and link into somehow. There could be a question of, actually, as we move to digital platforms, do we move away from looking at plans and projects and looking more at geographies? And what are the current situations for the environment in different geographic areas, and what might happen as we layer plans and projects on top of them? Session 2 of this series, when we talked about the progress in Western Australia, exploring those ideas. And then this concept of more open source data, open source tools, does that provide an opportunity for more democratization within the impact assessment process? to allow others than perhaps just the proponent to look at the environment. So some interesting potential areas where digital technology could take us, but where we're going to focus today is to listen to Atkins Progress, who are a member of the SNC Lavalin Group, and we're going to look at how those different technologies are being brought into enhancing the design of projects by integrating the environment into that process. So I'm now going to hand over to Paul Morgala. He's a chartered scientist. He's got over 18 years experience in both the water and environmental management industry, and he's currently the digital lead for Environment UK at Atkins, and therefore responsible for digital transformation in its environment business. He's an expert in GIS, Geographic Information Systems, BIM, which is Building Information Management, Business Information Management, never quite sure, data, information management, spatial analysis, etc. Specializes in technical delivery of complex technical projects and has a track record in successful delivery across a range of sectors: water, environment, energy, and experience across not just the UK, but also into Canada, Africa, and Asia. So, Paul, over to you.
Thank you very much, and hopefully everyone can see our slides. Yes, thank you all for joining us today. It's I appreciate for many of you this might be very early in the morning or very late at night, so we really do really appreciate the invitation to come and present to the IAIA. I just want to do a brief just sort of mention of who Atkins are, because I appreciate that many of you may not have heard of us. We're a design and engineering consultancy management consultancy, and we serve the sort of infrastructure, transportation, and energy sectors. We've been around quite a while as a company. We're founded in 1938 in London, and then we were recently in 2017 acquired by the SNC Lavalin Group, who are obviously based in Canada. We're a large company. We've got about 50,000 employees worldwide, offices in over 50 countries, and we've operated in over 160 countries. So we've certainly sort of spread our wings into many parts of the world. The environment business, where myself and my colleagues sit in the UK and Indian business, is around about 650 people, but then we have a global practice of around about 1,700. And just sort of on the just leave you with the sort of our sort of tagline for our sort of environmental work, which is better outcomes for the community and the environment by putting them at the heart of decision making. And hopefully that's something which you'll see throughout this webinar. So just to give you a quick introduction, Josh has already introduced me. I'm Paul Morgala, Associate Director, and I'm the UK Environment Digital Lead. Joining me will be my colleagues Dan Parsons and Piaccio Vecchia, who are both Associate Directors, both within our environment practice. The focus of our presentation today really is how we're using digital to integrate the environment across the asset lifecycle, and realizing that this isn't just about the design. This is about how the important role that environment has to make sure that when we're developing infrastructure schemes, that we're part of that process as early as possible, and we pull that golden thread of continuation all the way through into operation and maintenance. So the three presentations we'll cover today, we're trying to sort of capture some various elements of that asset life cycle and realize that it's all about making sure we realize the opportunities at the start, and then we make sure that we realize them at the end. So I'm going to start my presentation, and I'm probably preaching to the converted in this audience, but I just wanted to provide just a little bit of context to the work we're doing. So we know that the environmental challenges on this world and to societies are huge. Large number of disasters, large number of people at risk, and a large financial cost as a consequence. We also appreciate that the impact assessment requires, we spend a lot of our time trying to conform to existing environmental regulations within our various countries, and there's an enormous amount of challenges around that and how we achieve that, the conflicts and the tension around that too, but also the risk to environmental reputational damage that not doing this can happen to asset owners and governments and the organisations such as Atkins who are supporting them. But we're seeing this. We're also seeing this emerging theme now, and I think this is where we are slowly and rapidly becoming what we all realised we should be in the first place, which is a real at the heart of solving some of the big climate and global issues. We are, increasingly under pressure to make sure that what we develop and what we deliver is climate resilient, is low in carbon, but also it isn't just about trying to do the least worst thing, but also to have a positive outcome on society. So whether that is people positive or nature positive. So today's webinar is about digital, and I just wanted to start with talking about sort of what do we think we mean by digital, and the when we talk about it. And first of all, we will say it's more than just a label. So certainly with our company, we're now moving to a point where digital is root and branch underlying everything that we do within the organisation. But more importantly, it's very easy to get caught up talking about technologies and software and miss the most important point, which is about the people. Without taking your people and your in your organizations and you as professionals along with this, then we never achieve what we want to achieve. And so one of the focus and one of the key points we want to make on this webinar is about what we're calling the digital mindset, which is realizing that the people element of this is just as important, if not actually more important, than when we talk about sort of data and technology. So just to sort of flesh out what do we mean by that, it can be very much around a mindset. This is about thinking about how we are delivering projects and schemes in a way that we haven't done previously. We've been over the last 20 years, very document heavy, lots of paper, lots of drawings, lots of reports, and a lot of that intelligence is caught inside of those outputs rather than somewhere where it's accessible. And so that digital mindset is really thinking about how do we use data? How do we rethink the way that we deliver work to think in a sort of a data-driven approach rather than a document-driven approach? And that is far more important than just the technology that we're using. And we work at Atkins in a very large organization with probably more funds than most, but a lot of what we're going to talk about today can be really achieved with very sort of open access to sort of open data tools. One of the most brilliant tools that we use within Atkins is QGIS, which is an open source and freely available GIS software, and there's other open tools as well, which really empower and really provide sort of levels of access to data that have been inhibitive in the past, but also that access to data as well. And there are sort of from a global, regional, and a national level right across the world, there is a really opening up of data in the last 10 years, and that's becoming more prevalent. And the techniques for gathering that data is becoming lower cost, which means more is becoming accessible in increasingly more detail. And so I don't feel that this all has to come at a cost. I think there's an enormous amount that can be achieved with very little sort of capital investment. And then finally, I'll go back to that people piece again, is really think about how you're upskilling yourselves and your teams in sort of digital and data capabilities. There is no shortage of free training available in the world now, and you taking personal responsibility for your own development. So we're very much, I think what we do today is not going to be what we do tomorrow. I've been in the industry for 20 years, and if I reflect back to where I was 20 years ago, the way I do my role has massively changed in those 2 decades, and it's going to change again. And so that digital mindset is really thinking that what I'm trying to achieve may be very similar in terms of impact assessment, but the tools and the skills I'm going to need are going to evolve. My job role is going to evolve as a consequence of technology, and it's my responsibility to make sure that I continue to develop my skills and my knowledge to be able to support that. So, and that's been a fundamental investment and fundamental message that we have internally within our own company to our own staff, who are rather fearful of technology, who are rather fearful that they're going to become obsolete. So the main topic of I want to talk about is what we're calling environmentally integrated design. And there's the headlines on the slide there of what we mean by that. What we're trying to achieve is better outcomes in what we deliver in terms of infrastructure delivery and schemes and projects on the ground through earlier engagement. Underpinning that with a data-driven and digitally enhanced approach. But what we're really trying to do is influence decision makers earlier, particularly in the design teams. We work in an engineering company, and very much engineers have often been the leaders of infrastructure projects from day one. Engineers have played an enormous important role. I'm not dissing engineers whatsoever, but it's realizing that there is a wider influence that's required if you really want to make infrastructure which really meets the needs of its population and supports our wider environment. So the focus of environmental integrated design is really about getting some of that early environmental thinking into the design process, to look to avoid and reduce environmental impacts and effects much earlier, but also shift the conversation from being a negative conversation to a positive conversation, to be not just about the constraints of what infrastructure shouldn't do, but also look to unlock some of those opportunities of what we should be doing. So just to peel back the sort of the layers of the onion of what do I mean by that? On the left-hand side there is sort of a description of the sort of traditional way that we've sort of gone about design in the industry, which is very much the environmental input of it's been very much reactive. So we start with the design first. That gets handed over to impact assessment specialists, who then try and understand, well what are the consequences of that? Try and understand, try and quantify those impacts, and then work with engineers to try and fix some of that. And it's very much a reactive process. It's very much an iterative process, and it takes an enormous amount of time and an enormous amount of cost. And we often find ourselves just caught in this loop of sort of late identification of issues and revisions. And we find ourselves just talking about mitigating the worst of those impacts. It really doesn't, we're really sort of often on the back foot. And what we're trying to move to is on the right-hand side of the slide there, you can see, which is an environmental integrated design, which is a lot more proactive and a lot more outcome-based approach, where we set the context of what we're trying to achieve from the environmental perspective as part of a scheme, and I'll go into some example of that in a minute. Identify what are the environmental constraints and the opportunities as early as on, and then create a framework for designers to then work within. So we're not taking away the engineer's role in this, but we're having a much earlier influence and much earlier engagement as part of that. And that means that we were able to identify opportunities right from the off. And the more we identify early on, is the more likely they're going to happen, because there's something which is sort of baked in from the start when the big decisions are made. We avoid the worst before we've even started. And then where we do have impacts, there's always going to be impacts and trade-offs, is we can focus more on reducing those effects and improving the overall outcomes. So I just want you to do a sort of a project example which explains what we mean by that. This is a rail scheme in the UK, which is currently in development. And Atkins worked on a piece of work. It was it won an ESRI award, Analytics Insights Award back in 2020. That really sort of got our thinking around this environmentally integrated design approach and what we mean and where do we want to go. And it was really that thinking which has allowed us to expand and grow this across a whole range of other projects since. what we do on this project, we started with the outcomes. We started with, well, what is it we want to achieve in the first place before we've done any design whatsoever. So you can see on the left-hand side the sort of topics that we sort of looked at, which is classic impact assessment topics, and really set some environmental objectives or outcomes we wanted to achieve. For example, we wanted to enhance biodiversity as a consequence of the scheme. We did not want to have an impact on sort of cultural heritage. We do not want to have to increase flood risk, and sort of and we had sort of objectives against each of them. And what we did as part of this piece of work, I said before we start the design process, was make sure that those environmental outcomes are sort of embedded into the heart of the mindset of the thinking of the whole team. So we started with collecting the environmental data, and you can see on that map there the whole smorgasbord of different environmental receptors that we often have to handle. They're large, they're various in numbers, and very much our job is often to try and sort of thread the needle and between into all them to try and come up with a viable scheme. So, and we're in the position now where the prevalence of data is more often, and we can rapidly collect that data. So it's also reflecting that it's not all the data. There is some data that we collect, we have to collect during the scheme, some things we have to survey, but it's about getting that, what is that starter for 10 as we sort of go forward. So once we got that baseline settled, we then start to go through the process. So we started with developing those early corridors. Again, these are not single lines of a particular route, but also these wide sort of brushstroke areas. And then focus on identify what we want to avoid. So you should be all familiar with the mitigation hierarchy. Starting at the bottom where ultimately we prefer to avoid, and that's very last resort we would offset. And so really embedding that, what do we want to avoid, right into the start of the process. So identifying those features that we really don't want to impact, or if we do impact, then we have early sight and early warning of them. Then we look at everything else that's available and start to quantify that potential of mitigation required. So we in this particular case, we required what we called a red, orange, yellow, or sort of a ROI score to really identify, try and quantify the different types, because some things are more important than others, and be able to display that and influence that with the design teams and the wider delivery teams. And at this stage, starting to focus on the early side of constraints and unlocking those opportunities. And then once we've done that exercise across all the different disciplines and all different things, we can then sort of consolidate that information in an easy way that everyone can understand. So you can see here where we've basically got a matrix there where we've gone back to those objectives that we originally set out. We've analysed against the different receptors. Well, what would that impact be? And you can see in each of those columns is reflecting a different option that we were looking at this stage. And you can see from the environment scale, we've identified which of those would have a sort of a major adverse effect, but also focus on those that are going to have a positive effect as well. It shouldn't all be about the negative. And so you can see that we've got reds in biodiversity. This was a rail scheme. Dropping lots and lots of ballast would obviously have an impact on the existing biodiversity during construction. But then during operation and maintenance, there's opportunity to expand and develop new habitats as a consequence. So it's really giving a really objective way of how environment can consider to be part of the scheme, bearing in mind we haven't done any design yet. And I just want to touch on the opportunities as well, because I think this is really important, that our role is no longer about mitigating the worst anymore. Our role is really about how do we bring those new opportunities to enhance the environment and work with nature and communities to our projects. How do we elevate that vision by working with nature and supporting communities to deliver that resilience? I'm not going to go into detail, but you can see on the wheel there just some of the things that we're doing at the moment, a range of things from biodiversity net gain and implementation of natural flood risk management and sustainable drainage, up to introduction of renewable energy or affordable housing, or other ways that we can enhance society as well. And at this stage, it's really about focusing on the art of the possible, and making sure that those business benefits are brought in. So I just want to wrap up my slide now before I hand over to Dan. Just to summarize there, what we're talking about in environmental integrated design is creating better outcomes for early engagement, realizing the business case benefits earlier than during more traditional approaches, but using sort of data and digital in an enhanced way, in a way that really underpins that thinking. Influencing decisions earlier, avoiding reducing environmental impacts, and then unlocking those opportunities, and then very much making sure that we carry them forward into the rest of the process. And this isn't just wishful thinking. So on that note, I just want to pass over to my colleague Dan. If I just introduce him, Dan is an associate director at Atkins. He's with 15 years experience in the industry, and he is an experienced environmental impact assessment coordinator who has led many projects of large and small scale across the international and across nationally and international significant projects. Thank you, Dan.
Thank you, Paul. If you just move on to the next slide. Okay, thank you. Right, if you just move on to the next slide again, Paul, please. So I just wanted to sort of draw back onto this this first slide, just sort of which shows the whole project life cycle. So Paul's just talked about how we can use digital technology and data to improve environmental integrated design at the sort of early stages of projects. So the feasibility stage, looking at option selection, and that basically gets you to a point where you've chosen an option for the project that's sort of ideally the best environmental outcomes possible, and then we're going on to the next stage now. So how do we get consent for that project? That's the point where we start to do the more detailed impact assessments, EIA, ESIA, and the such like. So that's what I'm going to do talking about today. Next slide, please. So firstly, I just thought it'd be worth revisiting why we should digitize EIA in the first place. What are the benefits for it? Now, in my view, there's two key reasons. Firstly, it can help solve existing problems, one of which I think is demonstrated quite clearly with this photograph. So this is a photograph of the of part of, not even the whole, environmental statement for HS2, which is a big high-speed rail scheme in the UK. And if we think about what the point of EIA is, it's about informing decision makers, communities, about what the effects are, so that decision makers can take that information into account when deciding whether to consent a project. Communities can engage through consultation. But if you are struggling to understand what those effects are because you've got to wade through a mountain of reports, then that impacts on the quality of decision making. So that's a problem. And EIAs, certainly in the UK and in Europe, and I know it's also the case in much of the rest of the world, are becoming increasingly complex. The amount of detailed information and analysis is getting bigger, and the breadth of topics that are being considered in EIA is also growing. So this is a problem which is, if anything, getting worse rather than better. So one possible solution to this is the digitalization of the process. We've also got the issue that because assessments are becoming more and more detailed, that means they're also getting more and more expensive. And so again, digital can help make this process more efficient, which ultimately saves money, which is a good thing, because that money can be spent on other more positive things, like improving the environment elsewhere. So that's the sort of problem bit of it. There's also a strong case for digitalizing EIA in terms of unlocking opportunities, and that sort of builds on the work that Paul was just talking about. So we can integrate the EIA process, if it's digitalized, into other project digital tools such as BIM and GIS, and that makes the information more accessible to project engineers, architects, decision makers, planners, people like that, which means that we're engaging with the project much earlier on in the process at sort of key decision making points. And that means we're starting to draw the environmental information into the heart of that decision making process. And that is a real driver in terms of getting better environmental outcomes for our projects. And then lastly, as I've just sort of mentioned, we can by sort of digitalizing it, we can start to automate big chunks of the process which are traditionally labor intensive, and that makes the whole process more cheaper and more efficient, which means we can work and think about other aspects of the project and looking at opportunities to improve environment. Next slide, please. So that's why we should do it. There's been a number of attempts, I think, over the sort of last sort of few years as to sort of how it's been done. And as sort of Josh mentioned earlier on, there's no sort of key definition for what digital impact assessment is. And I think in EIA, it varies quite widely. So at one end of the scale, we've got just simply the sort of the digitalization. The simplest approach is just submitting a PDF of your documents, and it's a sort of a digital copy of a paper-based report that's then hosted on a decision maker's website or a developer's website. And then at the other end of the spectrum, we've got quite sophisticated interactive websites which make use of good quality graphics and visualizations and modeling outputs to really convey a sense of what the project looks like and is going to feel like, and it's a much more immersive experience for somebody to try and understand what the project is and how it's going to affect the environment. And then somewhere in the middle, we've got things like digital non-technical summaries. Most sort of big kind of EIA consultancies have an option for those. We do, and they normally supplement the sort of traditional paper report or PDF that is submitted as part of a consent application. So these have been around for a number of years, and the benefits are clear, as we just sort of mentioned, but we haven't really seen the widespread adoption of this. And the key reason for that, in my view, is that regulators simply don't accept the sort of more sophisticated interactive websites as an alternative to the sort of more traditional report, even if it's in a sort of just a PDF format. So that means that if you want to go down the route of publishing your environmental impact assessment report in this sort of interactive, digital, immersive website way, then that's in addition to also producing a paper report, and that can be quite a costly exercise. And so we don't generally see many projects doing that unless there's a real clear benefit to doing that, because for example, community consultation is a really key driver or risk to the project succeeding. Then it might be worth the investment, but for most projects it's an expense that you don't really get the value back out of. Next slide please, Paul. So we've thought about coming to this from a different direction. Like how can we get the benefits that digital EIA can promise, but will also be acceptable to regulators? And so what we've done is sort of taking that digital mindset approach that Paul mentioned, is shifting the focus away from the presentation of information and data in a digital way through sort of interactive websites, and actually kind of building tools that digitize the entire process of EIA. So you've got a digital model of the entire EIA, and by doing that, we're shifting away the role for the EIA coordinator, and it's becoming much more about data management and data flows. And we can also then build the tools to actually produce the reports that will be acceptable to the regulators, but we're still getting the benefits of interacting with the engineering teams earlier on in the process, so you're getting those better environmental outcomes in the first place, and we're also able to produce reports which are more accessible to decision makers and the public. So that's our sort of take on it. So if you go to the next slide please, Paul. So how we've done that, this is a sort of a concept of our sort of digital model that we've produced. And if you take the kind of core conceptual model of EIA back to basics, which is shown in the sort of grey box at the bottom there, we've got an environmental receptor. Your project has an impact on it. You introduce some mitigation to reduce the impact, and it results in a residual effect. What we do is we basically layer in information as we receive it through 3 common data environments that sort of feed into this model. So we've got one for the environmental receptors, one for the impacts, and one for the mitigation. And right at the beginning of your project, you can include all the information that Paul was talking about from those earlier feasibility studies. And then you straight away, you start to understand, well, where are the main impacts going to be? And then as your project progresses, the scheme design develops, you have a better understanding about how it's going to be constructed, so you understand more about what the impact's going to be. Maybe you undertake some modeling, so you start to quantify these things as well. And also in terms of understanding the environment, you might do new surveys where you identify new receptors. You just constantly layer this information on a continual basis, so you've always got snapshots of what the effects of your project are. And that's a really powerful communication tool to go back to the engineers at the decision-making process. They've always got the best available information for them. They don't have to wait till the end of the project when the EIA is finally published. Next slide, please, Paul. So we're starting to get to a point now where the whole process is digitalized. It's not just about the presentation. And it becomes much more about data and information management of flows. And as sort of Paul said earlier, we've not done this through sort of quite expensive platforms. We've just built this in Microsoft Office applications using Excel. But there are other open source alternatives available which are free to use as well, which have exactly the same functionality. So the key is really about thinking about how you use these tools to sort of manage the process in a sort of data-driven way. And then once you start to do that, you can use the added functionality of these tools, such as all the functions and script writing capabilities that they have, to start automating some of this actual process. And then that's where you start to see the efficiencies, and you can get results much more quickly, and you also save time and effort doing it as well, and reduce the sort of man hours required. And that gets you results much quicker as well, which again helps to feed back into the design process. And then finally, we've got a flexibility in reporting. Because we've captured the whole process in one spot, we can actually export the report in a way which is acceptable to the regulators as a sort of traditional paper report. But we've created that report in a digital way using these digital tools and thinking. And so going back to the slide that Paul showed earlier, where we've got the sort of shift from the traditional point where we have some design, there's a design freeze, we then do the assessment on it, and then that goes back into a cycle of feeding back into the design. We're moving much more to that diagram on the right, where we're just seeing the EIA evolving in parallel and continuously with the design. So by the point the design's finished, the EIA is also finished, and they're both sort of being undertaken in parallel. Next slide, please. So this is the last slide I have. I just wanted to sort of show you sort of some outputs that this tool can produce to sort of demonstrate that it's tangible. And the way that we've sort of created the reporting aspect of it is really just mirroring that sort of basic structure of the EIA model, where we have the receptors on the left of this table on the screen. Then we move into the impact, the residual effects, and then finally whether that's going to result in a significant effect. And it just makes the whole reporting process easier to understand, but it also makes it much conciser. So we're starting to move away from these big lengthy reports with lots of narrative and text into much more concise and easy to understand information. So that's all I wanted to say about that. I'll move on to hand over to Pietro. He's a chartered engineer an environmentalist with 30 years experience in addressing environmental and social risks and impacts. He specialized in leading environmental and social management systems, impact assessments, due diligence, best available technique assessments, and environmental risk assessments. And he works in multidisciplinary, multinational teams for a broad range of public and private clients in the Middle East, Europe, Africa, and Asia. Over to you, Pietro.
Thank you very much, Dan. Yes, in this section, we address how we can support the compliance of the project with the environmental requirements. After the IAIA has been completed and finally approved, and this is a peculiar moment. There is a severance between, there is a before and after. Because after the approval, typically new players enters in the game, there are new contractual arrangements, new schedule. So it's not obvious to transfer smoothly across these environmental requirements and incorporate them in the tender packages, in the transfer to the designer that have to develop the residual part of the design or the design, the mitigation measures, and to incorporate in the management systems like the construction management plan and operational management plan. Because the environmental requirements are often many, not so easy to be managed, and we describe how digital solutions can help that. Next slide, please. So it could be useful to classify, to categorize the environmental requirements into two categories: the minimum requirements and specific requirements, depending basically on the sources. So the minimum requirements are coming from environmental regulations, standards, objectives of the proponent, and other standard IFC performance standards, while specific requirements are originated by the IAIA itself, so are the mitigation and the control measures, and also the permit conditions. In addition, also, there could be specific agreements that the proponent has stipulated with third parties. So the difference between the two is the minimum requirements are quite spread across the organization in a sort of uniform way. They apply to everyone, while the specific requirements are often referring to specific sectors, characteristic of the areas, portion of the project, and we will focus on the specific requirement. Minimum requirements are mostly managed as embedded in design. They are part of the basis of design or are part of the legal register of the project, while specific requirements require more additional attention. Next slide. So this workflow show how the general process work. Basically, the minimum and the special requirement are combined and transferred to the other and collated with the other project requirements. However, this ideal scheme is difficult to implement because of some challenges that the specific requirement pose, and then we have developed and we need some more sophisticated tool. Next slide. So this is summary of some of the challenges that are affecting the specific requirements. I don't go in details, but you can see often there are many. You have seen the IAIA for HS2. You can imagine how many requirements are hidden there. I have worked on projects with 3,000 requirements to be managed. This was quite a lot, but in the order of hundreds is quite common. They are dynamic because there could be new agreements, new permits that come into force, and so they could be managed along the way, while the minimum requirements are more steady. And often some of them are vague, so they must be interpreted. They have contractual value. They are possibly part of the tender packages, and they have contractual ties with the limitation on working certain time or period. They may originate the necessity to new permits, or they could be linked to the permit validity, or also they're applicable only under condition, only if specific circumstances are verified. We will see this in more detail in the next slide. And they also may be applicable to different entities. No, sorry, back to the previous slide. So yes, and they have also interfaces. They may conflict with themselves, among themselves, and also they are not easy to be traced. They are not easy to. They are not easy to be recorded. Their implementation across the development. Next slide. So these are some of the conditions of applicability. We can see that there are special conditions. Special conditions are the special conditions are depending. Sometimes the requirements are applicable only to certain jurisdictions or to designated area, or sometimes they are pointing to specific receptors, a specific river, or a specific historic building. There are temporal conditions, so some of the requirements are applicable only in certain season, like the breeding season, or in summer. They could be applicable only during nighttime, or depending on the phase of the project. Some of them must be implemented before construction can start, for example. They are linked to technological aspects, like some activities, earthworks, removal of topsoil, which kind of plants is used, a crushing plant, and linked to emission. If there is a release of wastewater, for example, this obligation will apply. And finally, to external conditions that are, for example, if the speed of the wind is above a certain value, you need to water the whole roads. So how to manage all these conditions and all these challenges is not easy. Typically, the main tool that is used is a commitments register, which is a spreadsheet. And at the spreadsheet are added for where every requirement is copied, and where for every requirement are added attributes like the relevant stage of the project to which they apply, the project element that are impacted, the entity that are responsible or accountable with, sometimes they are linked to action trackers, and the level of risk, of the magnitude of cost, so they can prioritize. So this is quite common practice. You can find on internet several examples of commitments register, but what we have done is to go one step forward. Next slide. So we wanted to create a system, a digital system that is able to identify the environmental requirements that are applicable to specific activities, specific region, in order to filter and to focus on a subset of requirements that are relevant for that specific activity or contract or element of the project that need to be designed. And to do that, we have created three filters, basically: a spatial filter, a technology filter, and a program filter. So they are working in combining GIS and spreadsheet linked together. Next slide. This is the spatial filter. So the spatial filter is a geoprocessing tool. It works by defining a perimeter, that is the black area in the middle, where we want to know which environmental requirements apply. And the geoprocessing tool is checking which layers are intersected by the perimeter, and each layer is linked to a code that is linked to the commitment register. So to explain better in the next slide, the process is of the geoprocessing tool is basically this. The first thing is to upload on the GIS the layers that are linked to the spatial condition of the requirements. For example, if a requirement is asking to do something specific on designated areas, protected areas, I need to upload all the protected areas. Typically, these are available on open source data, and assign to them a code and link the code to the specific obligation. Likewise, another example could be other work in 300 meters from water courses. You need to adopt certain precautions or adopt certain strategies, and this means that I need to create a layer in GIS where the rivers have a buffer zone of 300 meters, and again I assign a code. I then design the perimeter of the area of interest. That could be the perimeter of the activities where the contractor will operate, or the perimeter of the area that has to be designed by the designer if we are still in a design stage. And I run the geoprocessing tool, and I get as an outcome a list of codes that are intersected by the perimeter, within the perimeter of the area, and the attributes that are linked to the areas that has been intersected, that give a context as well, like including the name of the protected areas, for example, or the name of the river that has been intersected. Next slide. So this data is then combined with other sets of codes that I generate by filling a questionnaire that is related to the specific activity I need to filter, which is asking which stage I need to consider, because environmental requirements may apply to only to design, or to all the stages, or only to operations. So I filter that characteristic of the requirement, and the jurisdiction. That is very important in linear, very long projects that are crossing several regions, and some of the obligations can be valid only in some of the regions. And the start date and end date that I need to, when I need to operate, which is compared to the temporal constraints of the obligation. For example, if there is a breeding season defined in a certain way, the commitment register is able to check if the interval of between the two dates where the operation will take place is intersecting the breeding season. In addition to that, I fill a questionnaire that is asking which kind of activities will take place. This, as an example, valid for construction. In case of design, will be a different questionnaire. The questionnaire can be modified, questions can be added or cancelled. So it's very flexible tool. Of course, the codes that you see on the left column must be linked to the right environmental requirements. So as a result of that, the spreadsheet as a macro, which is able to hide the requirements that are not applicable by combining these codes, and they can combine also in with logical operators and or not, depending on how the requirement is formulated. And the outcome is a selection, a subset of obligations, of requirements which are applicable to that specific case. So this is an example of how we can make manageable the environmental requirements in a context where their quantity or their complexity would create some problem to manage them effectively, and is show due diligence in the way we will interact with the various entities that are in charge of implementing these requirements by assigning the requirements that are applicable to them. Next slide. So in conclusion, this is an example of a tool that is not demanding in terms of software requirements, can be carried out with QGIS and an Excel or equivalent. It requires quite good knowledge, advanced knowledge of Excel and GIS. The job processing tool can be considered an investment, but following the steps also manually, the same result can be obtained to extract the special codes. And it enables to focus on only on the environmental requirements that are applicable to specific designer, contractors, operators. So this can help to build the tender packages or requirements for specific pieces of design, and also narrow the scope of the verification after the review, audits, and inspections to check if these requirements has been effectively implemented. Overall, there is a reduction of risks and liabilities that are connected with the lack of implementation of the environmental requirements. And finally, is also provide a support for optimizing the construction phasing by finding way around for example, the temporal constraints that are along for a linear infrastructure, and thinking, for example, they are along the line. You cannot work in certain period in certain areas, so you can have this with the support of GIS. You can have this sort of planning tool, and also to improve the quality of the design, the residual design that you have still to develop after the IAIA approval. For example, for ancillary facilities or for mitigation measures that may intersect or not areas that are subject to environmental requirements. So that's all for me for this last section, and now I would like to hand over to Paul for the final remarks.
Sure, thank you, Pietro. Just a quick summary, and then we'll hand back to Josh to facilitate questions and discussion. So what we looked across the is how digital environmental and impact assessment can be applied right across that asset life cycle. Hopefully we've demonstrated as well that that digital mindset is key. That digital isn't just about acquiring expensive technology, but just rethinking on how we can deliver impact assessment in the modern age. I've talked about how we can that left shift, really trying to get environmental thinking and using data and digital approaches to get environmental thinking earlier into the process where it can have a biggest impact. But then through Dan and Pietro there, trying to show how that golden thread, that handshake between the different stages, making sure that that data is brought all the way through and decision making associated with that border is brought through each stage to make sure that, that the benefits that we've identified at the start get realized on the ground and we have that sort of positive environmental outcomes. And on that note, I'll hand back to Josh.
Thank you very much, Paul, and of course, Dan and Pietro. So I will just share my screen. So let me just make sure I'm showing the right one. Can I just confirm, Paul, that that's the slides that you're seeing?
Yes, that's right.
Very good. Okay, well, yes, we've got around 15 minutes now for an opportunity for Q&A across Paul, Dan, and Pietro. So I've had a few questions and thoughts myself to get us started. Just to respond to a few questions that did come in, the slides and the recording will be available, as Bridget mentioned earlier, so don't worry about that. That'll be contacted through the IAIA probably tomorrow. To jump into some more kind of technical questions and in related to that, I guess just to pick up, Paul, on some of that summary area that you were just touching on. You talked about this digital mindset. You talked about a need to kind of bring the staff with you. How do you go about convincing people to adopt a digital mindset beyond just kind of saying, this is how we do it at this company, so you're either with us or without us? How do you bring people with you on that change? Perhaps first from you, Paul, and then if Dan and Pietro have got thoughts as well.
Sure, and a top-down, you shall do it is certainly not the way to win hearts and minds. Change is enormously hard, and I'm not going to say this is easy in the slightest, but I think it's really about selling the benefits and understanding what those benefits are to the different stakeholders, different people involved. And I think the challenge is everyone's got their take and everyone's got their role in this, from someone who's a technical expert, say an air quality expert undertaking an air quality assessment of the scheme, up to a client, up to stakeholders and members of the public. It's really understanding what are the benefits to each of those individual groups and making sure that we can convey that in a way that they appreciate and understand, that they can feel that those benefits are sort of appealing to them.
Mm-hmm. That's really useful. Dan, Pietro, anything you want to add from your experiences working with your colleagues?
Yeah, I could chip in there. So, I mean, as an EIA coordinator, I sort of, tend to work with lots of colleagues from various different teams, and a lot of them can be, they're very sort of guidance driven and don't often, they're a little bit resistant to change in terms of like overall approach sometimes. But I think the key message is that it doesn't fundamentally change the impact assessments they're doing. This is obviously I'm talking about the sort of digital EIA aspect of it now. But really we're focusing on how we just improve on the reporting side of it, and that's where we can drive a lot of the efficiency, because the bits of the process that those specialists are really good at is all the like data acquisition, modeling, and impact assessment, and none of this changes that. They still have to do all of that work. What we're looking at doing is making the sort of actual sitting down and writing the reports bit a lot more efficient, and that's something that most of them don't really like doing anyway. So I think once they sort of understand that and realize that actually there's benefits to them, because it means they can focus more of their time on the bits of their work that's more interesting to them, then actually you start to get buy-in much more easily then. So it's a lot of it's about just education really, and just trying to explain what you're trying to achieve and why you're trying to achieve it.
Okay, thank you very much.
To add in the context of the environmental requirements in the post EIA approval stage, I would say that digital can be a convincing element to bring the proponent, the client, on a route of tracing and with the due diligence, the implementation of the requirements across the project stages. So it is an effective tool for having a good auditable system in case something goes wrong, and these alleviate the risks for the proponent in case of litigations. So it's a very robust system to keep a trace of who is accountable, responsible for having this, keeping consistency of the design and the construction with the requirements.
Okay, thank you. There's quite a few questions coming in. I'll jump to one of those, I think. So quite a lot of your benefits, obviously, as you indicated, you know, the legislation or the regulators are still like, where's my hard copy environmental statement? I think that's the same in many areas. So you guys are very much focused on, well, okay, what can we do within the constraints of that system? But one of our, Natalie asks, is there any kind of legislative or policy changes that would be needed or could be helpful to encourage a shift to more digital outputs, and what might they be to kind of, I suppose, blow this thing up a bit wider kind of thing?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, yeah, I think it does require a sort of legislative change, and I think, I mean, in the UK, we're you know, we've just finished a consultation on a sort of replacement scheme to EIA called the Environmental Outcome Report, and within that, there's a section on digital. Whether it goes as far enough as being able to accept the environmental statement in a sort of, you know, fully interactive website as an alternative to the sort of traditional report, I think remains to be seen, and I suspect that might be a step too far, but I think that ultimately that is what's required. I think it's that, you know, it's the sort of regulatory change is what's going to be needed before we're going to sort of see that wide scale adoption of those sort of more interactive websites.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Any other thoughts, or there's plenty of other questions? I'm happy to ask another one.
I suppose the one thing to add to there as well is what I mean by sort of digital submissions, and is it those interactive websites which are essentially just you know, very often just a lot more engaging, but an interactive web version of what can be a rather cumbersome and linear report. I think. But also, I think what underpins that is what is it that's being presented, and I think where the shift would be, and again, this will require legislation for, is submitting 100,000 words is not the answer. Submitting 1,000 words backed up by a series of data sets for demonstrate and underpin that with evidence, I think needs to be the way it goes. So actually there is associated data that explains how those impacts are being mitigated, etc., rather than just trying to fill the gap with words in the hope that that might give enough information to get it over the line.
Mm-hmm. Okay. To kind of pivot from that a little bit. So obviously you guys are working in the UK. It's a quite a data rich kind of market to work in terms of environmental data, GIS. The government's MAGIC system, which is a multi-agency geographic system, has been operating since the 90s, late 90s, I think. So it's been around for over 20 years. Obviously, there's other parts of the world where data might not be digitized, or if it is digitized, it might not be on a reliable web link. So it's stuck in someone's building, and you've got to go and get it, or it's stuck in paper documents. How far could the things you're talking about today be kind of brought forward in a more data restricted type environment?
I think if I start off from the IAIA point of view and sort of using the tools that we were sort of talking about in the presentation, I don't think it makes any difference, because you still need to acquire that data, whether you're doing it sort of more traditional analog way where you're writing reports. You still need some evidence and information to underpin that, and that's no different to if you're doing that whole process in a digital way. So where you're working in countries where you don't have lots of open source data available, you use what you've got. You've still got access to tools like Google Earth and things like that, but if you don't have the data that you need, then you go out and collect it. You do the surveys, and actually that's no different to whether you to then take that information once you've got it, and then you use it to input into your report in a sort of more traditional linear way versus a digital way. So the digital bit of it is almost it's about using the data you've got and that you would have anyway, no matter what approach you do, and you use it more intelligently to produce a more readable report in a more efficient way, and being able to engage with the design team earlier on in that process.
Mm-hmm. That makes a lot of sense. Yep. Thank you, Dan. I can see from what you were describing, Petro, as well. Obviously, that's taking information that has been generated by the process and carrying that forward. So by that stage, it is about that data management that you guys were talking about. So that's really useful.
The situation, I mean, the open spatial data set, for example, that are available globally are growing, are quite good quality, and therefore the fundamental data, land cover, designated areas, hydrography and catchment areas, all these data are available basically everywhere. So there is a good starting point, and of course to be integrated during the baseline data collection. Also now it's easier digitized data and link to GPS coordinates, and importing GIS data collected during the baseline phase.
Mm-hmm. And to jump a little bit more, I suppose, into a bit more detail on data, get a bit more techie. So obviously you're getting into the process. This is a question from Simon. You're getting into the process, you're getting data, pure data. There is a protected site there. This is the water quality in this area. But then obviously from that, you're generating via the impact assessment process, etc., lots of information, interpretation of that data. What do you do to kind of, I suppose, protect or distinguish between what is actually data and what is now interpretation of data, and how that's managed? Is that something that's important in the metadata, in how it feeds into the engineers and others?
I think it's a really good point, and I think it's something that it does need to be managed. I think Dan made a really good point earlier that the role of an environmental consultant and is becoming more of a data manager, and we make a very clear distinction between what is the raw data, what is the data that we've brought onto a project, and what data we have derived or generated from that data, and try our hardest to try and keep an audit trail of that change. Because there's one thing we're guaranteed on any project of any size is there will be change, and therefore understanding and measuring that change and being able to track that change is becoming increasingly more important. And that's where, as you said, the metadata becomes more important. So tracking what is the information about information and making sure that thing, and then putting that and making and doing that in a way which is accessible by others. So particularly on large schemes where we get lots and lots of people, We have lots of different disciplines looking at information. Understanding what they're seeing and what the limitations and the consequence of what they're seeing is really key, and that investment in data management is probably been quite a core one for us, to make sure that we have common processes in the way that we in the way that we deliver our work.
I think, yeah, just also from the sort of the IAIA tool that we've built, we use like the core data that we manage through the common data environments as the inputs to the model, and then we have our sort of series of subject matter experts that then do their interpretation and sort of add their sort of professional judgment to it. So there's always an element of that. We're not automating that aspect of it, and that's key, I think. It just makes their lives a lot easier, because we're being able to give them the information needed at their fingertips, and then effectively their sort of interpretation and analysis of the raw data is the output of the model, and that's what we're using to report on.
Okay, thank you. So to kind of I guess take that forward, someone asks, and this was a question that came in before, but I think it's before the webinar, but I think it's quite relevant, is what kind of training would be useful for someone who's looking to progress their career more on the digital side of impact assessment, and are there training courses for that type of thing, I suppose, available? So if you're looking to not be an ecology specialist who's going to do the professional judgment, but you're perhaps trying to be one of these modern EIA coordinators, what should you be looking for, Dan, Paul, Pietro?
So if I just reflect the what we've done within our environment business, is we've focused on data skills, predominantly GIS. We work in a GIS world. We've shown various maps there. GIS has been a real enabler over the last 20 years, and becoming even more prevalent now. And we've gone from a stage where we probably had 4 or 5 GIS operatives who kind of did all that behind the scenes, to actually making sure that as many of our staff have those data skills at fingertips, so they're comfortable looking at data rather than just looking at reports. And what's been key about that is not just the young talented university graduates who actually already come with a lot of those skills because they learn them at university, but actually a focus on the middle grades, the reviewers, the subject matter experts who actually thought they could get away with not having to do technical work anymore and just read reports for the rest of their career. And actually we are working closely with them to realize that know your role is changing as well, and your ability to review data, understand what it's what you're looking at, and being able to sort of comment and remark on that is just as important. And so it's not just the skills, it's not just what the skills are, but where we're targeting those skills across the organization as well. And there's no shortage of free training out there. On much of my training comes from the likes of YouTube and other sort of online training platforms now. We do less and less classroom training now, and utilizing sort of online resources.
I believe that another skill that is very important in being able to apply a digital mindset is to be able to map processes, so to be able to understand, to be able to segment the processes in discrete steps and join them together and assign to, and because after that is done, it's possible to check which one of these is prone to be digitized. And this is something that requires a bit of understanding of process management and design and mapping processes.
Well, thank you very much. I think we're pretty much out of time, unfortunately. So there were a number of questions that came in that kind of link in mental health, the social side into this process, human kind of oriented design, etc., which I'm sure we could have had some good discussions on, but I didn't feel were kind of entirely within the side of things, but it's very understandable why the audience is asking them, because of course the international audience are often involved in environmental and social impact assessment. Hopefully some of you guys, both who are listening as well as the Atkins guys here, will be at IAIA 24 in Dublin, and I think that could be a very interesting discussion to have. Is, you know, is a lot of this digital innovation oriented quite towards environment, and, you know, is that perhaps posing a challenge for social, or is it also advancing that side? Unfortunately, not something we can get into discussing today. So thank you very much to Paul, to Dan and Pietro. I'm going to now hand back to, or Bridget is going to come back on and just do us a little bit of a closeout. But just before that happens, if I could just say, if you have something in the audience that you think, you know, is a digital innovation, a digital impact assessment thing you think might make a good webinar, then please feel free to get in touch with myself or IAIA HQ. We are looking at possibly doing additional webinars in this series, possibly linked to a digital impact assessment in parts of Africa, as well as trying to link into the outcomes of the DREAMS project from Denmark. So a little plug for potential things that hopefully will come up at some point in the future. And now some actual things that are coming up in the future. Bridget.
What a great segue, Josh. Thank you so much, Josh and Paul and Pietro and Dan. That was a fantastic and very interesting webinar about where things are going in the field of impact assessment. So as Josh mentioned, we do have some upcoming webinars. You'll see one coming up in July 19th on Geoportal of Migratory Austral Geese. It's an online tool, so it fits in with a digital kind of theme here. And then on August 1st, we have a live session of what's second in our Think Big 2050 City Mega Growth virtual theme forum. We had the first part pre-conference before our IAIA 23 conference, and now we'll have two pre-recorded panels of presentations that you can watch at your leisure. And then we'll gather together on August 1st, those presenters, for a live interactive discussion, and you can have the opportunity to ask them questions on their presentations or whatever that they discuss. So that you can register for either one of those now. So I just want to remind you that you will be getting a link to the recording and to the slides in a few days, and also that you will receive a link to a survey, a very short survey as you exit, and I hope you'll take just a minute to fill that out. It does help us as we are working to improve services for you, and maybe you've got an idea of a topic you would really like to learn more about, and that way we can provide that kind of information. We can seek out webinars based on demand, on what you guys want to see. So let's keep talking about this webinar, though. There's so much, as Josh mentioned, there's lots left to discuss. We hope we'll see you in Dublin, but also feel free to carry on the conversation online with the hashtags or on Twitter. IAIA members can also talk about it in our online community. So thanks again to Josh and our panelists, and thank you, our participants, for taking time to be with us today. We know that your time is valuable. We hope that you found this to be valuable as well. Thanks, everyone. See you next time.